The war in Ukraine may seem senseless, but we can make some sense of it. Why it's happening, what's being done about it, who the players are, and how this parallels past wars. You've asked us about all that and more. Thank you so much for these great questions. Now let's get you some answers. Joining us tonight are retired Colonel Brendan Kearney, a former U.S. Marine Corps Chief of Staff to Europe. Colonel Kearney, welcome to the program.
It's a pleasure to be with you.
And James Goldgeier, a visiting fellow at the Brookings Institution and a visiting scholar at Stanford. Mr. Goldgeier, welcome.
Thank you.
These are some fantastic questions, and I wonder, Mr. Goldgeier, if we might start with you and a very basic but smart question that Brenda left in our inbox.
Why is Russia having this war with Ukraine? Why? I just want to get a complete understanding of what is the reason behind it.
Brenda, that's a very good, very complex question. Mr. Goldgeier, what would you say to Brenda? Why is Russia having this war with Ukraine?
Well, I mean, you see these images, these civilians being bombed, this just brutal and unprovoked attack by Russia. It seems totally senseless, but it fits into Vladimir Putin's worldview. This is, all these grievances he's built up over the years, ever since the collapse of the Soviet Union. His views that Ukraine doesn't have a right to exist as an independent country, that this is a territory that belongs to Russia. And of course, he miscalculated badly because he thought going in with his military assault that people in Ukraine would welcome the Russians and agree that they should join Russia in a larger country. It's just absolutely mind-boggling that he's done this, but it was also predictable.
Colonel Kearney, what would you add to that in terms of Brenda's question? Why is this happening?
Well, this is an extension of what he did in the Crimea here a decade ago. So he's been very open in saying what he wanted to do. He's been very open in saying where he thought Russia's place was in the world, in Europe, and in his relationship with Ukraine. So Brenda asked a great question. I get asked that virtually every day. It's very apparent as to why he's gone ahead and done what he's done.
One of the other questions that comes up a lot has to do with NATO. We got several questions about NATO, including these from Priscilla and Loretta. Here's what they left in our inbox.
Why is it that Ukraine wasn't allowed to be part of NATO when they have been asking for years?
What prevented Ukraine from joining NATO previously?
Priscilla, Loretta, thank you for those questions. Colonel, can I stick with you? Give us a bit of the backstory in terms of NATO and Ukraine.
Well, there's two pieces to it. You have the military piece and you have the political piece. From a military perspective, there was an effort that's been going on for a number of years since Ukraine first indicated they wanted to join NATO, and that was to modernize their military so it met NATO standards. If you come into an organization like NATO, you've got to be able from the get-go, in case of having to go to an Article 5 situation, of being able to operate with the other NATO countries. And quite frankly, and Ukraine would admit this, they were nowhere near being close to meeting those NATO standards. So they've worked extremely hard over the last decade plus to achieve those. They weren't quite
Colonel,
there yet.
I'm sorry to interrupt you, Colonel. I'm very sorry to interrupt you, but you used a term I think we should clarify. You mentioned Article 5 responsibilities. Article 5 of the NATO Charter is the part that says an attack on one NATO country is an attack on everybody. It's what the U.S. invoked after 9/11, right?
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. The other piece of this, I was addressing the military piece, and I think I've got that point across. The other piece is political, and that is that NATO holds its members to high standards in terms of a functioning bureaucracy, and one that is supposedly has minimal impact when it comes to crime and corruption. And quite frankly, I think most outside observers would agree that the Ukraine had some problems with that they also have been continuing to work with. Bottom line is to both those questioners, the Ukrainians knew exactly what was required of them in terms of meeting the NATO standards. They were working mightily to achieve those standards. They hadn't arrived yet. And whether or not they end up in NATO is still a question that has to be answered in the future.
Mr. Goldgeier, we got a lot of questions about Vladimir Putin and his future. Here are some questions that Joe and Betty and Brandon left in our inbox.
Who's going to arrest Putin for these war crimes? And isn't invading another country a war crime in itself?
Why can't we just do a covert mission to take Putin out? Problem solved.
How come we don't attack Putin now and end it all? Why are we waiting in the first place?
Thank you, Joe and Betty and Brandon, for your questions. Mr. Goldgeier, what would you say in terms of just the options for what to do about Vladimir Putin specifically, personally?
Well, the options we've chosen are to use sanctions and, try to punish Russia as much as possible, punish the people around Putin as much as possible. Those sentiments that were expressed in the questions are totally understandable, but Putin has engaged in this illegal war, committing these war crimes against Ukrainian citizens. That doesn't mean that we should then do something illegal, like assassinate a foreign leader. Ever since President Ford issued an executive order against assassinations of foreign leaders, the United States, has sought to be very careful about something that would be seen as illegal and would certainly generate enormous opposition against the United States from the Russian people. I think we just can't be in that kind of business. If Putin is going to be removed from office, it has to come from within Russia.
And can we also just be clear on this, Mr. Goldgeier, just to carry this a little further forward? I appreciate you using the word assassination, because that's what we're talking about, right? We're talking about killing a head of state, which is literally an act of war. But also on top of that, I don't think our allies would go for that. I don't know how we convince NATO and our friends in the European Union and Canada and the UK that that's our best idea in terms of how to deal with this. I just don't know how we would do that and have any of our allies follow us into that plan.
Right. And just remember, right now, Russia is the global pariah. The international community is united against Russia. There were 141 countries that voted for that UN resolution condemning this aggression. That's where we want the focus to be, on Putin and his illegal activities. We don't want to muddy the waters by doing something ourselves that would be counterproductive, illegal, and would generate enormous opposition, not only within Russia, but as you suggest, in other countries as well.
So that kind of a direct approach is probably not going to fly with the international community, but there are other kinds of military options that have been contemplated. For those of you who missed last night's show, we had a long conversation, this really wonderful debate about the prospects of a no-fly zone over Ukraine. If you missed that, go check us out on social. We're at NBC Now tonight. Very much worth watching. But another thing that came up, Colonel, had to do with UN peacekeepers, putting them on the ground. Here's what John wants to know. Listen.
Why aren't we having peacekeeping UN troops there to help keep the peace or to provide protection for corridors?
Good question, John. Colonel?
It's an excellent question. There's a variety of reasons that it really isn't practical to use United Nations troops in peacekeeping. First of all, you essentially have to have both sides agree to the peacekeepers being on the ground. And I don't think either the Ukrainians or the Russians are at that stage right now where they would agree to have the peacekeepers there. Secondly, traditionally, most of these peacekeepers come from countries that, quite frankly, they need the money. Their troops, their militaries are underfunded, and by going on UN peacekeeping duty, they end up being able to build up the coffers for their own countries. You make money. And I don't think there's any countries out there right now, absent one or two, that would want to put themselves in between two belligerents that really have engaged in a total combined arms warfare. It would be brutal. It'd be very tough to ask even the most professional military forces to be put in that type of situation.
And Colonel, I just want us to be clear. We've talked about a lot of different kinds of military engagements, no-fly zones and Russia's attacks and Ukraine's attacks and NATO and UN peacekeepers. These are different kinds of militaries, right? The UN peacekeepers are not there for the same reason as NATO, which is to defend NATO members mutually. Like, these are very different kinds of organizations with different kinds of missions and limits on what they'll do.
That's right. And really, it takes a highly capable, well-trained military force to handle the type of situation that this type of peacekeeping operation would involve. And I just don't see anybody out there right now that would do it, let alone not NATO, the UN expressing the willingness to go ahead and put UN troops in that type of situation.
Let me get to a few more questions before our time is up. Mr. Goldgeier, we've heard a lot of comparisons between World War II and now. I wonder if we could go, just for the control room, to question number 7, which is an email from Andy. Andy asked, is Russia getting away with so much simply because everyone's afraid to stand up to Russia and trigger World War III? Wasn't the Budapest Memorandum of 1994 supposed to protect Ukraine from what's happening right now? I'm going to ask you, Mr. Goldgeier, to just answer that first part. We did talk about the Budapest Memorandum on this program not too long ago. That was the deal that got nuclear weapons out of Ukraine in exchange for a kind of gentleman's agreement that they would protect it from invasion. Russia broke that agreement. But what about that? The phrase World War III gets thrown around a lot these days, Mr. Goldgeier. Is that an apt concern?
Well, anytime you're talking about potential conflict with a nuclear-armed adversary like Russia, which is the other nuclear superpower other than the United States, I mean, you have to be concerned about escalation to major war. I mean, right now, this war is limited, unfortunately for the Ukrainians, of course, they are bearing the full brunt of this Russian assault. It is limited to Ukraine, and NATO is being very careful while supplying Ukraine with weapons to help the Ukrainians defend themselves. NATO is being very careful. President Biden has been very clear that U.S. troops, NATO troops aren't going to be going to Ukraine, not going to establish a no-fly zone, which would then have to be enforced and could lead to shoot-downs of Russian planes. So I think, there's a legitimate concern about escalation, and Russia is a nuclear-armed adversary, and Putin has raised the specter of nuclear weapons use in this war. So it's this balancing act between trying to do as much as possible to support these brave Ukrainians and not escalating to a broader NATO-Russia war.
Let me see if we can squeeze in one more question that we got here in Manhattan on this glorious day in New York. We spent some time down at Washington Square Park, and Colonel, we heard from Shovik, who had this question. Watch.
Realistically, how long we can expect this war to go on, and what would be the political outcome for Russia and Ukraine?
It's a good question, Colonel. The end game. How long might this go on, and what would be the political outcome for Russia and Ukraine?
Well, it is a great question, and Shovik clearly has been thinking about it, as we all have. How long will it go on? It could go on weeks, months, years. Particularly the longer term is if the Russians somehow manage to pull off short-term military success by taking over the country. They will then fight a long-term guerrilla warfare that I see just lasting years and years and years. The political outcome, obviously, is going to be determined by the participants themselves and how this does end up ending, whenever it does end. Russia could change its approach tomorrow if Putin was removed or somebody else took over the power there and said, okay, this is crazy, let's back out. That would be a good approach, step number one. But I don't think any of us see that happening anytime soon. The Ukrainians politically, they're not going to give up. They're going to keep fighting, and they're going to, I think, continue to do the magnificent job that has impressed the entire world here over the coming weeks, months, if not years.
I'll tell you one political outcome that I would suspect, at least if things continue on this trajectory, that Ukraine will become a closer member of at least the Western international community, and President Zelensky's star will continue to rise. I think he has impressed all the right people and been asking a lot of the right questions, so we will see if that continues. This has been extremely helpful. Colonel Brendan Kearney and Mr. James Goldgeier, who made a little time for us on his birthday to answer some questions. Gentlemen, we appreciate you sharing your insights tonight. I didn't want to embarrass you till the very end. I didn't want to distract you, but many happy returns to you, sir, and thank you both for being with us. We appreciate it. I'm sorry, I've spilled state secrets. I'm very sorry, sir. Thank you both very much. We really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Now, chances are these answers sparked some more questions for you. That's a good thing. So please, keep them coming. Anything at all that you would like answered. We are at NBC Now Tonight on Twitter, TikTok, Facebook, and Instagram. You can always reach us directly by voicemail, 888-575-2NBC. That's 888-575-2622. Or email us nowtonight@nbcnews.com.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.